Good evening. We are waiting for Vanessa Frazier to join in. We'll start shortly. Hello again, good evening, and welcome. I'm Daniel Darmanin, the President of the Justice and Peace Commission, and it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you here in this great hall in the Archbishop's Curia. We have gathered here today to mark the 60th anniversary from the publication of Pacem in Terris, an important encyclical written by Pope John XXIII at a time when the world was undergoing significant changes and facing numerous challenges. 60 years later, the world is very different, and yet similarities abound. Today again, the divide between the East and West is growing, whilst polarization between ideological camps is becoming the norm. The threat of nuclear war is on the horizon, whilst many countries are still struggling to overcome poverty, inequality, and social injustice. The message of Pacem in Terris remains crucial today. Pacem in Terris, first of all, serves as a reminder that every person deserves to be treated with respect and compassion, and that promoting human dignity is essential for achieving peace and justice. Indeed, unless there is justice, there can be no peace. This is the origin of the name of our commission. Our name is our mission, but as time goes by, the more I realize how complex the work of justice and peace is. For today's event, we wanted to delve deeper into how, as a country, we can and should continue the work and practice for the peace emphasized in Pacem in Terris. Having a seat at the UN Security Council, which, despite its many deficiencies, remains one of the best tools for achieving peace in the world, is a big responsibility for a small country like ours. Many say that Malta has always punched above its weight when it comes to peace building, and this could be also attributed to the neutrality clause in the Constitution. The question, however, remains, what sort of neutrality do we want for our country? Do we understand neutrality as a way of shirking responsibility, remaining indifferent to evil and turning a blind eye to injustices, all for the sake of self-preservation? Or is it a tool which enables us to be able to build bridges and a means to broker peace and prevent conflicts? The former type of neutrality is a dangerous and unethical position that fails to acknowledge the suffering of others and perpetuates a cycle of violence, whilst the latter implies an active involvement with different sides to find common ground, promotes dialogue, and work towards a peaceful resolution of conflicts. As we look at the world around us, we can see examples of both types of neutrality. We see leaders who remain indifferent to the suffering of people, who turn a blind eye to injustice and who prioritize their own power over the well-being of humanity. I believe that this type of neutrality is not true neutrality. It is complicity in evil. At the same time, we also see leaders who work tirelessly to broker peace and promote dialogue, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They recognize the importance of engaging with different sides, of listening to diverse perspectives, and of finding common ground to build a more just and peaceful world. I'm sure many of those present here today have very strong and maybe even opposing views about this subject. However, we think that it is part of our mission to create spaces of dialogue and encounter, even though we might not convince each other. As Pope Francis reminds us, dialogue is the oxygen of peace. I hope that you have a pleasant evening and that the discussion will stimulate each one of us to strive for peace on earth. Pacem in terris. Thank you. I now invite Mark Kakia, Executive Officer of the Commission, to present the guests and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Welcome once again to everyone. Very, very brief presentation of the hopefully 5 speakers, because Vanessa is not yet online, we will have with us tonight. Father Carlo Calleia read for his doctorate in moral theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry and is a resident academic at the University of Malta in the areas of theological ethics and applied ethics. Professor Edward Warrington is an associate professor in the Department of Public Policy at the University of Malta and is a specialist on governance and institutional design and has a particular interest in microstates. Mr. Rainier Sadni is a member of the Department of Anthropological Sciences at the University of Malta, where he teaches political anthropology and the anthropology of the Middle East and North Africa. Professor Anna Kaki is an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at the University of Malta. She holds a PhD from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And finally, Ambassador Vanessa Fraser joined the Diplomatic Corps in 1992 and throughout her career has been posted to the Maltese embassies in Washington, twice in Rome, London, Brussels, and New York, where she is currently serving as a permanent representative of Malta to the United Nations. Without further ado, our first speaker, Father Carlo Calleia.
Your Grace, Bishop Galliaturmi, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, good evening. Okay. Good evening. It is an honor to share with you my views on how Malta's neutrality serves the cause of peace. If you don't mind, I'll be reading my contribution. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth no, I tell you, but rather division. Most of you would have recognized these words from the Gospel of Luke. These poignant words, uttered by Christ, the ultimate pacemaker, might jar with what is being discussed today, neutrality and the cause for peace, for which our world craves so much at this point in history. But I believe that these words of Christ can help us frame a bit better our understanding of neutrality in the Catholic social teaching tradition. With rather thick brush strokes, I would like to make my argument based on points taken from Pacem in Terris and other church documents, and I'm going to make 3 points. First of all, that neutrality does not imply doing nothing. Rather, it urges us to do something on an international political level, and therefore neutrality as taking a proactive stance. Second, neutrality calls us to take responsibility for our actions. And third, neutrality urges us to create a culture not merely of war, just war or pacifism, but rather one of peace building. So first, neutrality implies adopting a proactive stance. On the 7th of February 2019, during a conference on the Holy See and the Vatican in the new international context held in Rome, Vatican Secretary of State Cardinal Parolin had stated that the Holy See deploys that positive neutrality which is typically its own, that is, not the neutrality of one who stands at the window and watches the course of conflicts between powers, but rather that of one who, without taking part in either one or the other, takes positive action to favor the overcoming of conflict. Moreover, at least twice in 2022, on Victory Day and later on Remembrance Day, in his homilies, Archbishop Charles J. Scicluna reminded the Maltese faithful that being neutral does not mean being complicit in the injustice that war brings, and he insisted that while maintaining a neutral approach, we must still take a stand against aggression. In the name of justice, Archbishop Scicluna said, in the name of solidarity, one cannot be neutral. One must take a stand. The words of Parolin and of Scicluna echo the words of Pope Francis, who, reflecting on the words of the Gospel that I've just read at the beginning of my contribution, he commented, Jesus does not bring neutrality. This peace is not a compromise at all costs. Following Jesus entails giving up evil and selfishness and choosing good, truth, and justice, even when this demands sacrifice and the renunciation of our own interests. And this indeed divides. As we know, it even cuts the closest ties. However, be careful, Pope Francis continues, it is not Jesus who divides. He establishes the criterion, whether to live for ourselves or to live for God and for others, to be served or to serve, to obey one's ego or to obey God. Pacem in Terris sheds light on how a proactive stance can be held while maintaining neutrality. Although neutrality is only referred to in passing in paragraph 124 by quoting Pius XII in the context of countries that opt for neutrality for economic reasons, it later makes an even stronger argument for countries to safeguard the rights of all human beings at all costs. And one particular commenter, a Jesuit, the late Drew Christensen, notes that authorities must look beyond the limits of their own immediate jurisdiction and exercise powers in defense of the universal common good, not just where their own nations are affected, but in the interest of the rights of all persons, especially those who lack protection. This is known as the global political authority that Pacem in Terris puts forward. And this is also emphasized by Pope Paul II in his 2003 World Day of Peace message, where he supported the United Nations initiative and had argued that a universal political authority does not mean writing the constitution of a global superstate, Rather, it means continuing and deepening processes already in place to meet the almost universal demand for participatory ways of exercising political authority, even international political authority, for transparency and accountability at every level of political life. The second point I'd like to make is about taking responsibility for our actions by being neutral. It implies also. Okay. So in 2014, Pope Francis had called out the world war which is being fought piecemeal. And he took up this theme again in the 2016 World Day for Peace message and again in Laudato Si, where he says that in the world, there is so much going on with war, terrorism, kidnappings, and the misuse of power, which all are leading to this third world war being fought piecemeal. Putin's rhetoric that the war in Ukraine is the result of a decadent West cannot be trusted. And we can see no parallelism between him and Popes Benedict and Pope Francis. However, they too have in some way or another criticized the loss of Christian values in the West and cultural colonialization. And therefore, in the larger scheme of things, it is true that the uprootedness of Christian values, which formerly gave shape to Europe, including a healthy secular Europe, is a reality, and that the atrophy of Christian values will only spur violence and political disagreement even further. What are these values? The values of common good, of solidarity, of human dignity, freedom, and so on. So the third point is committing ourselves to becoming peace builders. In the history of the tradition of the church, there is, as you know, just war tradition. On the other hand, pacifism. Nowadays, both parties, both sides of the spectrum are coming together to a third form, which is peace building. And this is something that Pacem in Terris did for the first time in the history of the church. It called out war as no longer being a suitable way to restore rights once they have been violated. There is a shift, therefore, in Pacem in Terris towards disarmament and mutual and effective controls. Church teaching, therefore, moved from unqualified adherence to just war towards advocacy of nonviolent resolution of conflict. And this is something that we all have to take a stance in favor of. We speak nowadays not simply of peace, but of just peace, spelt as one word, just peace, which engages the grassroots, international and religious actors, puts social welfare over market economics, and prioritizes restorative justice. I'd like to end with a quotation by Pope Francis. When Pope Francis reflected on his visit to Malta, he had called Malta a laboratory of peace. Malta, in its entirety, is a peace laboratory. The entire nation, through its attitudes, its own attitudes, is a peace laboratory. And it can realize this, its mission, if it draws the sap of fraternity, compassion, and solidarity from its roots. The Maltese people receive these values together with the gospel. And thanks to the gospel, they will be able to keep them alive. Thank you.
Ambassador Fraser will be joining us shortly. She's currently leaving United Nations Security Council meeting. Professor Warrington, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was asked to speak about the purposes that Maltese neutrality serves in our politics, above all. But before I do so, I would like to speak about the constitutional provisions concerning neutrality because they are extremely interesting. Maltese neutrality is not regulated by legislation, but it's regulated directly by a fairly elaborate clause in the Constitution, sub-article 1(3). This is embedded in Article 1, which speaks about the character and the territory of the state. Article 1 is embedded in turn in Chapter 1 of the Constitution, which speaks about the state and the nation. In contrast to the first 3 chapters of the Constitution, which deal, as I said, chapter 1 with the state and the nation, chapter 2, the principles of public policy, and chapter 3, in a skeletal way, in a very schematic way, with citizenship. In contrast to the provisions in these chapters, which are for the most part dealing with principle, stating principles, Article 1.3, which deals with neutrality, is very detailed. Let's have a look at it. So it begins with a positive statement, namely to say that Malta is a neutral state actively pursuing peace, security, and social progress among all nations by adhering to a policy of non-alignment. This is immediately followed by a negative or a renunciation statement. So the sentence goes on to say, by adhering to a policy of non-alignment and refusing, this is the negative part, to participate in any military alliance. So immediately this orients us to the character of Maltese neutrality, which the remainder of the subarticle spells out in considerable detail. So it's fundamentally a military neutrality with a purpose, with a particular purpose, in other words, to allow this neutral state to actively pursue peace, security, and social progress among all nations. There follow a number of precise exclusions. So what does this refusal to participate in military alliances entail? How is it limited, and what are its boundaries? First of all, it says there ought to be no foreign military bases on the islands. Secondly, that foreign military forces should not use military facilities available on Maltese territory, except at the government's request in 3 circumstances: for the purpose of self-defense of the Republic, secondly, in pursuance of measures decided by the UN Security Council, and thirdly, which is in a way a restatement of the first circumstance, in the event of a threat to the sovereignty, neutrality, and unity of the Republic. There follow some permissions. So, foreign military personnel assisting in civil works or defense are permitted on the islands, and the second permission concerns the use of the shipyards by naval vessels of external powers. There is something somewhat antiquated about this, particularly the reference to the shipyards, because Malta, by the Second World War, was no longer fundamentally a naval base, it was an aerial base. And there is no mention whatsoever of the possibility of using Malta's airport for military purposes. Some comments about this interesting, fairly complex, and in some ways somewhat archaic clause, in others a very advanced clause. It is part of what I call the covenantal provisions of the Constitution, the first 4 chapters, 3 of which I've mentioned, the 4th deals with fundamental rights and freedoms. In other words, here, neutrality is part of a pact between the state and its citizens, and between the state and other states. As I mentioned, it's far and away the most detailed article in the first 3 chapters, and it makes law rather than being content with laying down a principle. As I read it, the balance of these provisions concerning neutrality tilts firmly towards the preservation of Maltese security. Not simply security against external aggression, but also the liberty of the Maltese state and the nation to flourish unconstrained by the strategic interests of great powers, which was one of the defining themes of Maltese history. What then, in light of what I have said, is the meaning and relevance of neutrality in Malta's domestic political landscape? I would say there are 2 points to be made in this regard. The clause on neutrality was inserted as part of a constitutional bargain struck in the early part of 1987 to settle a long-standing constitutional crisis. This is about halfway through the progress of Malta's constitution. The circumstances in which neutrality was entrenched in the constitution were not propitious for making it legitimate. However, as I see it over the last 30 years, there has formed a broad, somewhat uneasy political consensus around Maltese neutrality. At least the 2 major political parties seem to converge on this. However, in particular circumstances, there have been, once again, doubts and differences surfacing over the precise terms of Maltese neutrality. For example, over the question early on of the repair of American naval vessels in the dockyard. Quite dramatically, one of the leading issues in the run-up to Malta's EU membership. Would the common foreign and security policy mean that Malta's neutrality is somehow compromised? Once again, over Malta's stance in the Libyan revolution, and more recently in regard to the war in Ukraine. No question arose over whether Malta would be militarily neutral or not. However, the question of the application of sanctions, there seems to have been a little bit of unease over this. What is the fundamental purpose of neutrality? I'm going to depart from what the Catholic social doctrine suggests. Speaking strictly from the point of view of statehood, neutrality is a policy stance intended fundamentally to protect a country's security, particularly the security of relatively small, powerless states. It offers them the possibility of taking a distinctive stance in world or regional affairs, which, among other things, permits them occasionally to serve as honest brokers or to champion particular causes. I'm not sufficiently well informed about Malta's diplomatic record to say to what extent neutrality formally declared in the Constitution has been used for the purpose for which it was declared, in other words, to promote peace and so on. But even before neutrality was inserted into the Constitution, looking at Malta's diplomatic record over 60-odd years, I would say that there have been instances in which, in multilateral fora, notably the United Nations, Malta has used its influence, its offices as an honest broker, to sponsor some important global initiatives, particularly the law of the sea, intended to protect both human welfare, more broadly, and global assets like the seas. And Malta has also, I think, quite staunchly defended the Palestinian cause in a way which was very, I think, humane and understanding, and quite consistent as well. That's fundamentally what I have to say. So I would not say that Malta's neutrality honors in every respect, Catholic social teaching. There is an element of idealism about it. There's also a great deal of realism. Realism about Malta's circumstances, realism about its history for centuries. I think fundamentally, the intention is to avoid entanglements in military alliances in order for the country to flourish. This renunciation of military alliances also leaves a great deal of latitude to Maltese foreign policy to contribute to global peace and human welfare.
Thank you very much, Professor Warrington. Our next speaker is Mr. Rainier Sudney. In the meantime, we also welcome Ambassador Fraser, who has joined us from New York. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Sudney.
Good evening, everyone. I've been asked to answer 3 questions. How has neutrality worked in practice? Is there a place for it today? Is it desirable today? And I have the luxury of 10 minutes. Let me begin by giving 3 of my assumptions, which I think are important to lay out on the table. 1, political neutrality is not the same as moral neutrality. 2, it is reckless to think that you can join a military alliance to improve your moral life. Now, there are some good reasons for joining a military alliance, but a military alliance would like to be Godzilla, not St. Francis. The first casualties of war, and the military alliance is, of course, a machine geared for war, is truth, justice, liberty, and human fraternity. So let's get that out of the way. Finally, I think it is reckless to base a foreign policy or a constitutional geostrategic commitment to neutrality on the basis of guessing who and what is on the right side of history, assuming history does have a right side. So we have to take our decisions under the veil of ignorance, the fog of war and propaganda, and making the best that we can, assuming worst-case scenarios. Now, to get to the question, how has it worked, we've heard that more or less, if you look at the constitutional provisions on neutrality, you can break it up into 3 parts. You have a part which is extremely detailed concerning military alliances, and it's couched in Cold War language, which makes it very difficult to use without some kind of modification. And that became quickly defunct because this provision was passed in 1987. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, you could no longer speak of a Cold War or 2 superpowers. And then there are 2 other parts. You have a qualified pacifism, so we are committed to peace, qualified only by UN Security Council resolutions, which we can follow. And then there is neutrality, which, while it is not explicitly stated, in practice it has been the case that our neutrality is qualified by international law. In other words, we have had bipartisan agreement that taking a stand on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, where we deemed it that international law has been broken, would not in fact violate our neutrality. We have taken a similar stand on Ukraine, deeming, in our view, that international law has been broken or violated by Russia, even though Russia protests that it has not. So there are these 2, and we need to keep them apart, I think, in order to understand the dynamic. Because I would argue that one part has worked better than the other, or rather, the commitment, active commitment to peace has worked pretty well. It has a pedigree going before 1987 all the way back to 1964 because of the kinds of initiatives that Professor Warrington has delineated and which continued, and initiatives even after 87 concerning bringing climate change to the attention of diplomats in the United Nations, initiatives within the context of the Euro-Mediterranean framework as it was. In this context, neutrality tended to follow in the wake and very much the page boy of the proactive commitment to peace. The reason I put it this way is that neutrality couldn't be tested. Soon after it was constitutionalized, we had a unipolar world. It was not just a unipolar world in the sense that one superpower disappeared. It was a golden age for liberal institution building, in which the proactive commitment to peace by Malta could be pursued almost flamboyantly, and in which neutrality per se was never tested. And this explains why even the shallowest politician in Malta can give a pretty good off-the-cuff speech about Malta's initiatives in favor of peace and bridge building, because it really was part of the environment. For a long time, it became part of the hackneyed political discourse. But it is difficult nowadays to find a single politician who can actually even articulate the purpose of neutrality on neutrality's own terms. And that is partly because there has been a silence for different reasons over it, but it has also been because there haven't been the contexts in which it could be tested. And pre-87, the neutrality we did get was actually was Plan B. So Borch Olivier, even while pursuing a commitment to peace and justice internationally, actually wanted NATO membership. Dom Mintoff wanted the neutralization of Malta, didn't get it. So the neutrality that was eventually constitutionalized did not even have a very eloquent thinking of it beforehand, to the extent that some of the champions of neutrality sometimes spoke about it in terms of how to keep our heads down, and sometimes spoke about it, sometimes in the same breath, as how to stick our necks out. It sounds more like a rationalization. Now, we have always pursued our proactive commitment to peace within a geostrategic framework, which changed from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s. So in the 70s, the constitutionalization of neutrality and non-alignment, it was in the context of a clear arms race in the Mediterranean by the two superpowers, in the context where the southern Mediterranean was divided between countries that were more or less allied, at least in terms of military cooperation, with the Soviet Union, and others with the United States. By the time it's constitutionalized, by the early 1990s, actually most of the Arab countries are actually within the orbit of the United States. By the year 2000, even Libya is there, and the only exception is Syria. So that was the context in which why neutrality could not be tested. Sometimes we were debating neutrality and American warships when those warships were coming from an Arab country where they had just conducted exercises. Now, the reason why we're discussing the problem today is that the balance between these two has changed. We are now clearly in a multipolar world. So neutrality is back and is being tested, while the geostrategic vision that we used to have or used to depend on in order to pursue our commitment to peace has disappeared. What used to be the Euro-Mediterranean framework of the European Union died more or less 10 years ago. nothing has taken its place except a policing concept of the Mediterranean. The difference between the European Union and the United States, and before it the British colonial power, was that when the US said Mediterranean, it meant what the Sixth Fleet understands by the Mediterranean, a sea to be patrolled. When the EU spoke of the Mediterranean, what it meant was a geo-economic concept which necessarily had to include non-Mediterranean states like Portugal and Jordan, and on Gaddafi's insistence, Mauritania. All those issues have, for practical purposes, disappeared, and the only way in which the EU nowadays tends to talk about the Mediterranean is from a policing concept controlling migrants. So the geostrategy has gone, although there are plenty of other actors in the Mediterranean with a pretty sharp geostrategic vision of what they want. Turkey, Russia, China, the Gulf states are all active. Do you think the Gulf states want a democratic Libya or even a democratic Tunisia? Come on. They're not Godzilla, but they are sane. If an oil-producing country becomes a democracy, time's up for them. So we think that the Mediterranean may be marginal, but it is an illusion produced by the fact that we are not paying attention and that our conception of the world is being driven by the eastern boundary of Europe. That's not a bad thing in itself, but it is creating a blind spot. Now, we cannot discuss neutrality without first developing the geostrategic concept of the Mediterranean for our day. Then we can see if neutrality can actually help or hinder. To do it the other way around is to put the cart before the horse.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I was asked to talk about a more international perspective on neutrality, and I wanted to join my colleagues in first talking a little bit more about the definition, because neutrality is a thorny issue, and that's something that I will come back to in my presentation. Obviously, we have to first distinguish between neutrality in a particular conflict and neutrality as a more permanent stance in foreign policy. So if we take the particular case of the Ukraine war, we can see that there are a large number of states, in particular in Africa, but also countries such as India, that have declared themselves neutral, saying that this is not our conflict, and we do not want to in any way take part in the issues around it. Obviously, what we're discussing here today is the more permanent form of neutrality, or what in Sweden is called alliansfrihet I frid syftande till neutralitet I händelse av krig. This is something that none of you will understand, but it's a very often used sentence in Swedish, meaning non-alignment in peace, aiming for neutrality in the event of war. Swedish neutrality dates back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So Swedish neutrality was a long-standing cornerstone of Swedish foreign policy. There was a strong popular attachment to the concept of neutrality, and it was echoed in particular in the Social Democratic Party, which obviously has been in power for a number of years in the Swedish context. And this was true up until the early days of the Ukraine war. Before Sweden joined the EU, it had chosen what it called an active neutrality, which it didn't preclude it from being vociferous or loud, as some others would probably call it. One of the most famous instances date back to the late 1972, in late 1972, when the Swedish Prime Minister at the time, Olof Palme, held a radio speech in which he condemned the US bombings of Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. He called it a form of torture. He said that it was tormenting a nation to humiliate it, and he went on to compare it to a number of atrocities: Guernica, Oradour, Babi Yar, Katyn, Lidice, Sharpeville, Treblinka, and he ended by saying, now another name is added to the list, Hanoi, Christmas 1972. This led to a freezing of relations between Sweden and the US for almost 2 years. And this was a particular reading of neutrality. Switzerland, which was the other country that I was asked to talk about today, had a very different conception, which could maybe be called more rigorous or restrictive understanding of neutrality. Switzerland has been permanently neutral since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but its policy of neutrality dates back even further than that. For a long time, the way that the Swiss perceived neutrality was to say that it precluded even membership in the United Nations. So the Swiss state, although it hosted one of the main headquarters at the global level of the UN, was not a member until 2002. And that followed a referendum in which both the cantons, the majority of the cantons, and the population had to vote yes. And I lived in Switzerland at the time, and it was not clear until the last moment that there was actually going to be a yes. But there was, and Switzerland joined. Switzerland has remained outside of the EU, unlike Finland and Sweden, but neutrality was one of several considerations in this decision. So to summarize, Switzerland, like Sweden, has a very strong, long-standing, historically anchored tradition of neutrality, even though they have been conceptualized in very different ways. Finland, the third country that I'm going to mention briefly, is again a very different scenario, because neutrality was not a choice, but it was imposed on them after the Second World War. Finlandization is a concept that many of you will be familiar with, which meant that the Soviet Union had a say both over the domestic policies of Finland and over its foreign policy. So Finland's neutrality dated back to 1948, when it had to sign a peace agreement, a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with the Soviet Union. And that instituted Finnish neutrality. It was only after Stalin's death and the beginning of the détente at the international level that Finland could pursue a more active neutrality policy. But it did take care not to irritate the great powers. One of Finland's ambassadors to the UN once said that Finland tried to handle its relationship between East and West equally well, while Sweden tried to handle them equally badly. It refrained from criticizing the US, and in particular the USSR. So when the USSR went into Afghanistan in late 1979, there was in early 1980 a vote in the General Assembly asking for a retreat of Soviet troops. In this case, more than 100 out of 148 countries voted yes to demand this, but Finland stayed on the sidelines by abstaining from voting. It only became a member of the Council of Europe in 1989. So Malta became a member immediately on independence a year after, in 1965, and Switzerland had joined in 1963. Even though at the end of the Cold War, the Finns were free to stop this neutrality policy, they had kind of gotten used to it and come to live with it and think of it as the best solution in a difficult neighborhood and the best solution in balancing Russia. So it chose not to follow Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and abandon neutrality. Underlying all these three countries' is a strong orientation towards the values of the West: democracy, market economy, and the rule of law. So even though the rhetoric of neutrality has been very strong, in some instances, particular policies and unofficial policies have been sometimes less neutral, and that's something we could discuss later if there is time. So given the strong variations between Finland and Sweden and Switzerland, and the way that they have used neutrality and the way that neutrality was instituted, we could maybe have expected that the Ukraine war would be conditioned on this past, but that has not been the case. There's one single determinant for how these three neutral countries have acted in the face of the Ukraine war, and that's geography. So Sweden and Finland submitted their official requests to join NATO on the 18th of May 2022 because of their geographical position and the threat that they feel. Switzerland has not even contemplated NATO membership for the simple reason that they do not feel that threat. Finnish President Sauli Niinistö, who is well known for his frankness, said just before making the NATO request official, and he addressed Vladimir Putin directly, he said, "You caused this, look yourself in the mirror." So that was his way of saying, this is why we're doing this. Finland was obviously a part of Imperial Russia under the Tsars until 1918. So with Russian talk of recreating borders going back to Tsarist times, Finland felt directly threatened. And when Finland took the step of joining, Sweden in a way did not have that much choice but to follow suit because of the linkages of the defense policies of the two countries and the way that they were integrated in defense terms. So although Sweden has never been part of the Russian Empire and was hence not under a direct threat, it still took that policy line. Though Switzerland did not contemplate changing its neutral status, it did take some unprecedented moves after the Ukraine war. So it instituted sanctions against Russian oligarchs, which was the first time that it adopted sanctions which weren't UN sanctioned. So they were not decided by the UN Security Council, but by the EU. However, they have not implemented these sanctions with enormous zeal. They have seized around 7 billion worth of assets, but they are thought to be more than 200 billion worth of assets in Swiss banks. Moreover, they have refused Spanish, German, and Danish requests for the re-export of armaments. So basically, the Swiss have exported weapons. They're a large weapons exporter, and when another country wants to re-export, they have to ask the original exporter, so Switzerland, for permission. And they have not granted permission for re-exports to Ukraine of weapons and ammunition. Moreover, last month, it decided to destroy surface-to-air defense systems rather than sending them to Kiev. So they have some obsolete weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and also coming for destruction in the coming months are tanks, and they're going to destroy them rather than send them to Ukraine. So what we're seeing are very different foreign policy stances and very different understandings of neutrality.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaki. Now hand over the floor to Ambassador Vanessa Fraser from New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for logging in late, but the Security Council ends at 1 o'clock here, so it was just the time to get to my laptop and log on. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel discussion to mark the 60th anniversary of the Papal Encyclical. In my intervention, I will focus on Malta's current role on the United Nations Security Council. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Malta's tenure on the Council started earlier this year on 1st January after being elected by the General Assembly in June 2022. The two-year term provides Malta with an opportunity to contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security in a meaningful manner. It gives Malta a chance to work towards safeguarding the values and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, the foundational treaty of the United Nations as agreed in San Francisco in 1945. Malta's neutrality does not neutralize us, nor does it mean that we are indifferent to what happens in the world. It has not stopped us from criticizing and condemning actions that we consider to be inconsistent or in violation of the UN Charter and the principles enshrined therein. This is all the more relevant given the challenging times characterized by geopolitical tensions during which Malta is serving on the Council. Malta is a bridge builder committed to neutrality, disarmament, peace, and consensus through dialogue with all. Unfortunately, when neutrality is discussed, many times we focus on what we cannot do or what we perceive we cannot do. However, our neutrality ought to be perceived as a strength for Malta's foreign policy. It safeguards our effectiveness and credibility, allowing us to serve as a moral compass. It enables us to identify areas of common interest, forge consensus, and advance peace and security with all members of the Security Council, as well as the wider UN membership. Malta's moral compass on the Security Council is very clear. It is peace, security, and stability, dialogue, de-escalation, reason, and the respect of international law. This is what we advocate in the international community. In shaping its neutrality, Malta shares the international responsibilities of the community of nations and contributes actively to the needs of international solidarity in defense against aggression and in serving peace. Concerning peace, when neutrality was enshrined in our constitution, peace was still only considered at the time the absence of war. However, today, peace transcends this. When we talk about peace, we talk about democracy, rule of law, human rights, poverty eradication, education, gender equality, peace building, transitional justice, and climate action, amongst others. It is about rebuilding societies and creating the conditions for a peace which is sustainable. I will refer to a few examples in recent years and also as regards to the Security Council. In 2011, during the Libya crisis, which was mentioned by earlier speakers, Malta was thrown in the spotlight when two Libyan Air Force Mirage jet fighters unexpectedly landed in Malta. This was followed by numerous requests to assist in the evacuation of foreign nationals, wounded soldiers, and civilians. Malta became a humanitarian hub, and to this day, many are still grateful for Malta's assistance and the role we played in alleviating the crisis. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is another example. Only yesterday, in an open debate organized by the Russian presidency of the Security Council on strengthening multilateralism, Malta once again expressed its deep concern that Russia blatantly disregarded the primary function of the Security Council when it launched its aggression against Ukraine. This illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war generated one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War. A global grain shortage, hundreds of thousands killed or injured, forced deportations of children, worldwide anxiety for a nuclear disaster, and negatively impacted the credibility of this very council. On this occasion, Malta once again urged Russia to stop this war, withdraw its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, and turn to dialogue and diplomacy as the tools which can bring stability to the region. Disarmament and non-proliferation is another file on which Malta holds a strong and consistent position and pushes for a world free of nuclear weapons. Malta signed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the so-called TPNW, in August 2020 and ratified it in September 2020. Thereby, Malta was one of the first 50 states to ratify this treaty, effectively contributing to its entry into force in January 2021. We hope that the TPNW can inject much-needed momentum in the global disarmament discourse, which unfortunately have stalled in a number of fronts. The failure by a number of UN fora to move forward on disarmament files, combined with the erosion of a number of Cold War-era treaties and guarantees, particularly affecting Europe, has created a new sense of urgency to work on the multilateral front to ensure that existing treaties are strengthened and new ground is broken. The relevance of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention in the contemporary world are just a few examples of how we need to work together to ensure that the global disarmament architecture works. We cannot speak about non-proliferation without mentioning the DPRK, North Korea. Earlier this month, DPRK launched yet another intercontinental ballistic missile, and in doing so, once again violated a number of Security Council resolutions. Since the start of 2022, 11 intercontinental ballistic missiles have been launched. Malta was amongst those council members calling for urgent meetings to discuss these worrying developments. As a last example, but not less important, are humanitarian efforts and the protection of civilians. The protection of civilians over the risks of further conflict and humanitarian suffering is placed at the center of our work. For example, with Malta's support and participation in peace support missions, and its support and active engagement in the field of children and armed conflict. This also implies a strong advocacy for parties involved in armed conflict to observe international humanitarian law in full. It also includes supporting countries, in particular small island and small island developing states, and ensuring the organizations that explicitly exist to respond to crises are enabled to carry out their mandates. In conclusion, given the current geopolitical context and its own foreign policy environment, it is in Malta's interest to enhance its engagement on the international stage, deepen its participation in security structures and programs in support of peace and security, and orient its foreign, security and defense policy more consistently and coherently towards international cooperation whilst respecting its neutrality. Malta's enhanced international engagement is to be especially conducted within the structures and cooperative frameworks of which it is a member. It is to be achieved through concrete initiatives that would energize a proactive and dynamic interpretation of Malta's neutrality, demonstrating that it is not an opportunistic middle ground comfort zone. At a time of increased polarization, confrontation, and transactional relations, Malta is actively seeking political spaces for dialogue and building trust towards consensual solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to all the speakers for offering us your insightful views and for sticking to the 10 minutes. I know it was not easy. I don't know if any one of you wishes to react to the speakers, to what we have just heard. If not, we'll open the floor. I'm sure there are many people who would like to intervene. Okay, so we can start. Please, I ask you to, first of all, introduce yourselves and be brief and to the point, please. Thank you.
Michael Grech, teacher, impromptu translator, whatever. First of all, thank you for the exposition because, first of all, it went beyond the caricature that we normally come across in newspapers that neutrality is fence-sitting, whereas you explained that clearly it's not the case. Secondly, I would like, however, to address a direct question to any one of you. Do you think that the document as it is, we should stick to it or we should amend it? Because I mean, we got the impression when being invited that this would be part of the discussion. What do you think? Or it's good as it is, I mean, and we can stick to it.
Whether it's good as it is depends on what you want out of it. It's clearly defunct, which enables any government to make it mean what it wants it to mean. Now, if you want a constitution where a government can, on the spot, improvise its meaning, you'll be giving it a lot of flexibility. But clearly, the provisions of the constitution are not there to provide full flexibility. So, being distrustful of governments, I would think that we need to rewrite it. We need to decide whether to go for a minimalist updating, or whether to go for a maximalist updating, which would be reviewing what security means in an age where security involves ecological security and economic security. In a region where if you have an oil spill on Tunisia's beaches, which ruins what little tourism it has nowadays with respect to its past, that will quickly become a political crisis and possibly even more serious. So we may want to revise it. That would be my view.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. I actually, like my colleague here, wanted to hear, yes, my name is Ivan Grek-Mintov, leader of Partit Abba, Christian political party. The title of today's seminar was whether, with the context of the neutrality clause and concept, whether it's viable today. And I wanted to hear that point that Michael brought up. Our foreign colleague, the Maltese constitution actually states very clearly that Malta is a neutral country, which means permanently neutral, not temporarily here and there. So even if we break that on a minor occasion, we're breaking national and international law. And actively seeking peace is what it actually states. So we don't need to amend the constitution, we just need to apply it. In June 2008, Joe Muscat became leader of the opposition, and he left EU and joined the Malta Labour Party as leader. And in November 2008, there was a very important meeting held between Joseph Muscat as leader, President George Vella today as shadow foreign minister on one side, and on the other side, the US Ambassador Douglas Kmitch. And 15th of December 2009, Douglas Kmitch reported back to CIA, NATO, US Central Secretary of State, European Command, military command, and he basically blew the lid on the new leadership of Labour's direction with regards to matters of NATO, Partnership for Peace, SOFA, and obviously neutrality. He actually called the cable security cooperation dilemma. With Labour Party, it's a no-go. With the ruling Nationalist Party, it's slow-go. We're honoured to have the Prime Minister of the time here as well. And this is Douglas Kmitch's word back to CIA, to NATO, etc., etc. The PN Prime Minister's defense advisor and effective defense minister, Vanessa Fraser, codename Protect, said that Partnership for Peace, NATO, SOFA can't be signed without parliamentary approval, and opinioned that the Nationalist Prime Minister could not deliver that. So this is the position here we have of Vanessa Fraser, at the time so-called Defence Minister of Malta. So knowing full well that the government opposed, because at the time the Foreign Minister, a friend, I believe, was Slogo. Yeah, I need to give some background though. So she knew the position of the government, she knew the position of the opposition, and also what the Maltese law says. She nevertheless suggested a way around all three, the neutrality. So he actually says, Fraser suggested that the best course would be to execute SOFA incrementally by means of dip notes, and indicated she would contact the embassy with proposals which would have the approval of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. Chief of Staff at the time was Edgar Galia-Cormi. So here we have our political leaders here agreeing that things should change, even though they are illegal. And she goes on, and it actually says
please get to the point.
Yes, I'm going to get to the point. In this cable, George Vella basically says, yes, we know that Partnership for Peace and all SOFA, etc., is illegal. Despite all of this, the leader of the opposition, Joe Muscat, and George Vella himself, you can read it later on if you wish, are willing to ignore the law, basically, and come to a compromise, so much so that despite that Partnership for Peace is presently illegal in 2009 and still is today, because it was never, because it breaks the Maltese EU treaties law, they remained quiet. So despite knowing that the Constitution was being broken, despite Vanessa Fraser, I believe a relative of George Vella himself, stating that she's willing to find ways, and they found ways around it, and it's all described in this very important email.
Thank you.
My question is this then. In the background of all this, here we are having a discussion in the Courier itself about how the neutrality and how the Constitution can be used for peace. And we have people presently here who broke the Constitution, knowingly broke the Constitution. It's presently being broken, the Constitution. The neutrality is presently being, we all know that Alfred Sant won the 1996 elections by declaring the Partnership for Peace being illegal, etc., etc. He went on to win the election. So my question is this: why are we having a discussion about what the Courier says, etc., 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 what the international, all this, I thank you for your speeches.
Thank you.
But we are breaking the Constitution itself, and the people who breaking it are here. Why don't we, if we want to use the Constitution for peace, we should get out of Partnership for Peace immediately, because it is illegal, and then we should start using the Constitution as it is, because it states very clearly, actively seeking peace in a state of non-alliance, something which we are presently breaking, and we have been breaking it for years. Your position, your
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greg Mintoff. So often you actually use the terms differently. So you say non-aligned in peace, striving towards neutrality in war. According to international law, no, I mean this generally, because you were telling me, yes, so if you want to be permanently neutral, yes, I'm saying generally, I'm speaking generally now, that it's the general clauses that are usually used in various countries is non-alignment in peace, because neutrality normally is always in a particular war. But that in usual, no, let me just finish, gentlemen. Let me just finish. So normally in discourse, we talk about neutrality as a permanent solution. So that's something that the Swedes, the Swiss, and the Finns would do. But in technical terms, it would be a little bit differently. But we can disagree, but that doesn't matter. In the sense that Partnership for Peace, do you know which country joined first of all? Switzerland. So there are different, so all I wanted to say is that there are different takes on the way that Partnership for Peace can be combined with neutrality. Just to give you that Swiss example. Thank you.
Yeah, okay,
I would like
okay,
the opportunity to weigh in here, since
Ambassador.
I was mentioned by name more than once.
The floor is yours,
Can I? Do I have the floor?
Yes, yes, Ambassador Fraser, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I had to write down so many things that I think it was Mr. Greffentoff said that were incorrect, but I hope I have some time allocated to this answer. To start off with, in that WikiLeaks cable, I did not have a code name Protect. There was written Protect in brackets after my name because my name should have been redacted in that. That was what it means when you have, and we've seen it in other WikiLeaks cables. Now, whether they call me the so-called defense minister, everybody knows I was the defense policy director. The prime minister at the time held that is the opinion of the author. Remember that is not an official memo written by any Maltese. It is the opinion of an author who was an American ambassador, eventually discredited, in fact. And in many of the other cables that came out on Malta, had a lot of inaccuracies in his emails. When we talked about the SOFA being incrementally, doesn't mean that you build on top of each other. This is the difference between the British English that we speak and the American English. I was proposing that rather than signing the SOFA agreement, that there were ad hoc agreements for every specific visit. So, for example, if a naval vessel was going to visit Malta, then with an exchange of notes, we would allow certain SOFA requirements would be allocated. The problem that I have with people who discuss the SOFA issue, and we could have, and I would be happy to join if you would have another debate on it. Many people talk about the SOFA, but haven't actually read it. So I would ask the first question, have you read it? And do you know anything about foreign policy and the way treaties are ratified and adopted by countries? If you see the way Russia ratified and adopted and signed and ratified the NATO treaty, it has exemptions to everything that basically they might well not even have signed. We could sign we could have done one of the same, we could have signed the NATO PFP SOFA with one of the same reservations by the Russian state, saying that it is not applicable on Maltese territory. It does not violate Maltese foreign policy. It means we are only benefactors. It means that if our armed forces of Malta were operating overseas, they benefit from it, but no one from Malta does. So don't speak in a vacuum, please, and do not speak on a WikiLeaks cable, which is taken out of context and also in a vacuum itself. And not speak with a lot of assumptions when you don't have all the information surrounding it. There's a little bit of the information I'm going to give now, only because you mentioned it. I don't think that it is relevant to the discussion that we are having. And yes, everybody knows that the president is my uncle, but I'd like you to understand that I have been 31 years in the diplomatic service. I joined in March of 1992. And I'm sure that if I had to strive hard enough, we would find that you and I are relatives too. So please do not degrade me and my career and the achievements that I have achieved throughout this career with a lot of personal sacrifice of myself and my family, may I add, simply because I am proud to say that the current head of state is my uncle. But it has nothing to do with defining me and my career. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's try to stick to the argument, please, and not descend into ad personam attacks, okay? So some other, let's give a chance also. No, but this will become now, I'm sorry, this will become, I cannot allow this to become, okay, you can discuss further and send an email, whatever. Sorry.
Well, I've got a loud report. May I suggest...
and then, let's take 2 questions and then we'll continue.
No, I beg your pardon. I'm going to suggest to you, at one time, I did ask that there should be enough time. This is in respect to the audience,
okay,
who've probably taken great pains to come. No, you please listen to me. Who've taken great pains to come to here, so please do plan your thing. I asked you this in the very first place, to leave enough time for discussion. Right. Secondly...
Do you have a question, please?
Yes, I do, but I'm going to give some points to you first. Okay. Secondly, you not only restrict those who are speaking from the floor, but please do restrict those who answer or from the panel. They can go a little bit long and off the point, which is the case just very recently. I'm not going to the merits or not merits of what is going on between the two. So that's my second point.
Okay.
Now, my question will be very, very, very brief. There's so much to speak about, and I'm not going to go through the whole loss and lots of answers, etc. But I thought I was coming here to something speaking about neutrality in itself. And I'm glad for the exposition as to what the neutrality in our Constitution is. I tried to find out, but I didn't make enough effort. But you did expose it, Professor Warrington. By the way, I'm Dr. Mikhail Fenor. I'm a doctor. I've studied some theology anyway, and I'm a former helicopter flight commander, so I've got a military background in the first place. Just introduce myself. And in fact, it's on this matter, really. We're speaking about neutrality, and then we are started immediately to hear various definitions of it. It's a very modern sickness nowadays. So what would say neutrality really being non-alignment, quite frankly, and this proactive neutrality, and this sort of soft or hard or permanent or temporary, all that sort of thing, etc. Neutrality has been forced on some countries, it's been imposed on others. Just take Malta, for instance, to start with. I mean, it's not the whole population who was consulted as to whether we should take up a neutral, so-called neutrality in the constitution. It was an arrangement between the two parties, political parties. Okay, so Switzerland has her own reason, and Switzerland is very nicely so-called neutral, which it isn't and never has been, because it is just a balance between the countries around it. And it finances their money or whatever it is, and so it's, no one wants to drive tanks up and down mountains, quite frankly, and parachutists in. So just leave that. Finland and Sweden, and so forth, they've had their own reasons. They were part of the Tsarist Empire, but before that they were not. And Sweden, for instance, part of a so-called Lithuanian, Polish, and so on empire. So we don't start with any ideas that, you know, it's... Finland was just simply on the border there, and post-Second World War, Russia just agreed not to really have its forced into the Warsaw Pact because we say it's neutral. But let me come to neutrality. Neutrality, and what does it mean for Malta? And for boots on the ground, quite frankly. The simple question comes, and it is a very relevant question after all. Who and what and how will we be defended? Okay? Now, we've had an experience in our long history, in a long glorious history, etc., where people have turned up the gates or turned up the harbor port and said, right, you know, we need something from you. Water, or whatever it is, and so on and so forth, and then we go, and then we take over Malta. It's a case of Bonaparte on his way to Egypt, okay? Right, and the order of Malta was neutral. Right, so what did it serve for that? Then we have the 60s, 1960s, and I come in at the end of 1960s, I was commissioned from Santos in 1971, spent some time in Germany, got my helicopter flying license, that sort of thing. In fact, I trained only about 30 kilometers away from the inter-German border. This is important to know. When people have to live and see what it exactly means. And there was no such thing. There was no, the question's coming here, because the question is, what is the neutrality we're talking about, and how it's going to defend us? And we've got to be a bit real, a bit of realpolitik. That's the doctrine coming in here. You've got to see things exactly as they are and come to your diagnosis. And not so very things, and we've said something, for instance, in the United Nations, and that's part of our proactive neutrality, and we started then, quite honestly. So, essentially, neutrality is what some sort of, let me put it very crudely, wimp on the playground will say, right? Not small or weak, but a wimp on the playground would say, school playground would say, right, I'm not with your gang or the other gang, okay? But let's put it this way, there could be a positive element on one gang morally, you have to speak about morals, and an immoral thing on the other side. And says, right, I'm sort of between you two. That person is compromised anyway, straight away, yeah. So the neutrality of Malta that we're trying to either support or trying to change, and how much are we going to change it, or are we going to obliterate it from the Constitution? This is really something that I was expecting to hear this evening. And I wanted to hear how, in fact, neutrality, rather than how we've been so positive on the international market, or the international fora, rather, not market, how it has actually benefited us. Because so far, it's been brought out, history has played kindly to us. We did not have a cataclysm, the fall of the Soviet Union, it fell quietly, but very soon we're having a build-up now of communist countries, whether east or west, whatever it is.
Thank
and
you.
There we are under threat.
Thank you. Don't know if you want to react or maybe listen to another intervention.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'd like to say that I concur with everything that has been said by the panel, except some points mentioned by Ambassador Fraser, and I would like to comment on them first of all.
Introduce yourself. Sorry?
My name is Sami Mela. I do not agree that the Russian war in Ukraine was not provoked. The Russians are guilty, absolutely, of a war of aggression, which is the highest war crime. But it was certainly provoked. Europe invaded Russia twice in modern history. First in 1812, when Napoleon led the European armies, and then in 1941, when the Germans led the European armies into a war of extermination, and twice Ukraine was used as a stepping stone for these invasions. And twice it was a very difficult situation for the Russians. So besides the fact that there was an agreement, a Minsk agreement that was not honored and all that, so, and there was a civil war. I mean, it's not correct, absolutely not correct to say that the war was not provoked. It is 100% condemnable. It's not there's no excuse for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but it was provoked. And it has been escalated by NATO. On this matter, I agree with Pope Francis, who once described the situation as not being one of where one side is the big bad wolf and the other side is Little Red Riding Hood. This is what Pope Francis said. And up to this very day, he didn't even visit Kiev on condition. He said, I will only visit Kiev after I visit Moscow to try to bring peace. So that's one point I would like to make. The other point I don't agree with the ambassador is on the matter of SOFA. The SOFA agreement is only an extension of the American Service Members Protection Act. This, and also another law, which is called the National Defense Authorization Act. These two laws of the United States do not concern the United States internally. They concern the rest of the world. The American Service Members Protection Act authorizes the President of the United States to take all necessary action, including military action, in case any soldier, any service member of the United States or its allies in NATO is detained by the International Criminal Court. So we have a situation where there's an International Criminal Court that should be taking steps, prosecuting war criminals, but it cannot do so. In fact, it has been applied. In 2018, there was an attempt to prosecute, to investigate, actually, war crimes by the United States in Afghanistan. And the United States threatened to arrest the judges, and that was it. I mean...
Mr. Mela, if you can come to the point, please.
Sure. Oh, this is very important. And it happened again in 2020 when the US military was being investigated. Now, so far, then there's the National Defense Authorization Act that authorizes the military, the US military, to kidnap foreigners, to keep them without access to legal counsel and all that. Now, I'm saying this not because I'm against America, believe me. All this I know from the anti-war movement in America, and the peace movement in America, which is very strong, especially the Veterans for Peace in America. But the point is that the United States has committed so many war crimes that they want this SOFA agreement simply to make sure that no one in any country where there are the servicemen of the US Navy or the US forces, no one will be prosecuted. That's the reason for it. So there's no justification in Malta accepting the SOFA agreement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sadni, you want to say something before?
Well, in reply, I was trying to introduce a framework for realpolitik reasoning on our neutrality. The example of Sweden and Finland are relevant. They're not waffle, because they are examples of countries that took their neutrality seriously. They have universal conscription. They put their money where their mouth is. They invested heavily in their own defense. And they also show that you can be neutral and have security cooperation with military alliances while defending your neutrality jealously. So those are precedents which are important. If the broader point of your question, as well as that of Mr. Grech-Mintoff, beyond the details, which I won't enter, is that we need to be serious and not have a constitution that is treated as a hollow piety, then we have to be serious across the board and make sure that we do not say we are a bridge for peace and peace builders, while the country is also a center of a major arms and artillery trafficker to Africa. I mean, it's one or the other. I'm not alleging anything illegal, but I am alleging something incompatible. We cannot purport to be producing marijuana for medicinal purposes when the quantity suggests it's going to be exported to countries south of us, where the people making money off it will not just be organized crime destabilizing those countries, but also possibly terrorist organization, and so we will be indirectly financing terrorism and say we are a bridge for peace. So we either invest in our security services and our policing across the board and then say we're morally neutral, or else we should be discussing how to behave like a state before we discuss how to behave like a neutral state.
Thank you. I don't know if Ambassador Fraser...
Yes, may I add? So I respect very much what Mr. Melak's position on the situation on the war in Ukraine, but and that he considers it to be not provoked. But I have used language from UN General Assembly resolution of the 2nd of March, which met in emergency special session, and that the language describing the war is taken from there, and the General Assembly, 141 nations out of 193 overwhelmingly agreed that it was unprovoked, according to the General Assembly resolution. With regards to the SOFA, again, I really think it would be great if we had to have another debate on it specifically, but as I will respond only to the fact that you said that there's no justification in Malta to accept the SOFA agreement. Here, I will have to respond to this because there is justification, and I can use a very specific example. First of all, again, I really do encourage people to read the SOFA agreement because it is not quite what people think, not the perception that people think. It does not get out of jail free card for military personnel. SOFA agreements say that if there is, if visiting forces or members of a visiting force are on rest and recreation, they are not covered by the SOFA agreement, by any exemptions from it. Now, for example, in Malta, we had a situation where the Chilean naval vessel came to Malta, the Esmeralda, and one of the sailors went to Portugal on rest and recreation, did get into a fight with a Maltese, was stabbed. Maltese was dying very, very critical. The sailor sought refuge on the military vessel and was never handed over to the Maltese. Why? Because we did not have a SOFA. If we had a SOFA, the Chileans would have been forced to hand him over for jurisdiction and for trial in Malta under our jurisdiction. It is not a get out of jail free card. He got out of it because since we did not have a SOFA, maritime law prevailed, and they invoked the sovereignty of the vessel and decided not to hand him over since he was on their territory. So this is why this is one example of a justification when Malta should accept a SOFA agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. There is certainly room for a debate dedicated only to SOFA, but we don't have the time today. Maybe one last question, if there is anyone. Otherwise, I invite.
Twice or three times, yeah. I think it's very, very condescending of the ambassador 2 or 3 times to say, please go and read what SOFA says, etc., etc. Well, guess what? We have read it quite a few times, and we've gone through it.
If you have a question. Please.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I actually want to comment on what our colleague was saying. Absolutely 100%. This is exactly why I believe we should be taking our neutrality far more seriously, because here we have people who are actively breaking our neutrality. You said we should be taking, and I'm agreeing with you entirely. We have people here representing us in the United Nations who are actively breaking the Constitution and the neutrality. Why are we doing this? Why are we playing this ping-pong game of pretending to be neutral but actually breaking neutrality? This is wrong. We need much more seriousness in this country. And neutrality has an awful lot to provide for Malta in the present situation, only if it is used properly as it was meant to be in the first place.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to wrap up.
Thank you very much for clarifying.
Just a short comment, please.
It will be very short.
Thank you.
You haven't answered, no one has answered on the screen, as to how we are going to defend it. And this is the whole point, isn't it? Neutrality, or we can have part and part of it, or we can have no neutrality, and we will declare ourselves for the side that is morally good. I know no one's perfect in this world, but there is a huge difference between the two. We've got the latest example in Europe. So this is it.
Yes. No, unfortunately, we don't have all. Yes, unfortunately, we don't have all the answers. Maybe last intervention from Professor Kaki, and then Rainier. Thank you.
Well, obviously, there is no definite answer to that. I think that when it comes to a dire situation, such as that one that Finland felt after the invasion of Ukraine, then it was asking itself, the Finns were asking themselves, who is going to defend us? if they decide to take this further. And that's when they abandon their neutrality. So it's when there is a threat in the close neighborhood that this question will become more acute. Luckily for Malta, it is in a neighborhood which is far from peaceful, but where there are no existential threats to Malta. So Malta doesn't really have to, at the present moment, ask itself that question. When there is a much larger neighboring state attacking a state that is substantially also larger than Malta in the vicinity of Malta, it will become a different ballgame for Malta as well.
You will understand that no, don't have that sort of policy, please, because we don't agree with it. Russia or the other side. And so it's not a matter of waiting to see whether Finland had to ask itself a very great question, because it was going to change something after the Second World War, the agreement. Okay? Now, this is not the
Okay.
my question.
Thank you, Mr. Sam.
Unless your question is rhetorical, it would take a charlatan to answer it. How could any one of us tell you which country Malta should have a defense agreement with? What we can tell you is Malta did have defense agreements with countries. It did have security arrangements with countries. It did have training arrangements with countries. And there was a time when our armed forces were regularly and systemically upgraded. That is the path forward, but it is not this panel that will tell you which country it should be, because that depends on various other considerations to which we're not privy.
And if I may add something to that as well, is that we in this room will never be privy to most of what's going on. So when it comes to Swedish neutrality, we have found out after the end of the Cold War that Sweden had very advanced plans of being defended by NATO. So this is not something that the regular Swedish citizen was privy to until after the end of the Cold War. So there are a lot of things that also go on beyond closed doors that maybe Vanessa knows more about, but she's not going to tell us, etc. Thank you.
We can continue, obviously, the discussion after the conference for when we can share some drinks together. To conclude this conference, first of all, I would like to once again thank all our speakers and all those who took the time to come and participate in this very important discussion, which obviously doesn't finish here. And as I said, we don't have all the answers and we don't pretend to have all the answers, but we think that it's important that the discussion continues in some way or another, either by saying that no, we have to remain neutral at all costs, but what does that mean, as we said, even the definition of neutrality itself and what it means in this changing geopolitical scenario is not so obvious. So that's why it's important that this topic is discussed in all important fora, not only within the church, obviously. And to conclude this conference, I invite Bishop Galyakormi to address us.
Thank you very much. I thank the speakers, even Your Excellency who has joined us online, and all those who have participated here. I would like to conclude with a prayer, because we have already discussed enough, and this is the prayer of Pope Francis in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, one of the two prayers. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Put forth in our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. Thank you very much. Bye.